Welcome, everybody, to episode 22 of Generation Jihad. I'm Tom Joscelyn, and I'm here again this week with Bill Roggio. Bill, say hi to the audience.
Hi, everyone.
Bill and I are recording this via Zoom, as usual, and our buddy Phil Hegseth, who's doing our IT stuff for us, is listening in. So if you hear me reference him, that's why I'm doing that, because I'm talking to somebody who's here. He's not our imaginary friend. But speaking of imaginary friends, we're going to talk this week a little bit about conspiracy theories and how they're spreading online and that sort of trend and how that intersects with the world of jihadism. But before we dive into some of these topics, Phil is constantly after me to basically get you guys to go online onto Apple Podcasts and to give us a 5-star rating. That would be wonderful if you did that. Right now, I'm told we're at about 93. Again, I don't even actually check any of this stuff, so I'm told we're at 93 5-star ratings, and then getting over 100 because it's a nice round number and everybody loves hundreds of stuff. If we get over 100, that'd be great. So if you're listening to our podcast and you enjoy it and give us a 5-star rating, that'd be wonderful. Go give us that rating. And we're counting on you guys to be an informed audience, an intelligent audience, and a logical audience. And that's the opposite of the types of folks we're going to be talking about today. Because today we're going to be talking a little bit about conspiracy theories. And the way this started was the State Department's Global Engagement Center put out a report concerning 7 Russian proxy sites earlier this month and sort of how these proxy sites are spreading or are instigating sort of anti-Americanism and spreading anti-American conspiracy theories online and sort of agitating against American interests. I read through the report pretty carefully, and I looked at the sites. Some of the sites I was already aware of. I didn't find the argument in the report very convincing that these sites are having a measurable effect or a big effect on the public discourse. If you look at the traffic numbers for these sites, they're pretty small. It's small potatoes. And I think that most people, if you looked at them, you'd say, well, what is this? I don't really have to waste any time on this. And beyond that, I don't think these sites are really pushing a lot of stuff into the mainstream media. One of the bigger websites on this list in the State Department's report is a website called Global Research. I've been familiar with that website for years and from the people that run it, because they traffic in 9/11 conspiracy theories and 9/11 trutherism. And I haven't spent a lot of time in the public sphere combating that because I do find it crazy, and it's very difficult to combat that type of crazy. It reminds me of an old quote from a movie.
Where do they teach you to talk like this? In some Panama City sailor want a hump bar? Or is this getaway day and your last shot at his whiskey? Sell crazy someplace else. We're all stocked up here.
And that's sort of how I view that. That's sort of how I view 9/11 trutherism. But, the bottom line is this stuff is still salient to a certain degree online. And in fact, we saw just this week a Republican in Georgia. Actually, she won the nomination, the Republican nomination for a congressional seat there, Marjorie Taylor Greene. And she's dabbled in these conspiracy theories before in her past. She actually questioned whether or not a plane even hit the Pentagon on 9/11, claiming at one point that there was no evidence that a plane had hit the Pentagon on 9/11. Bill, I remember the video of the plane hitting the Pentagon. I don't see why anybody would even be saying something like this, right, Bill?
Yeah, I got to tell you, of all the 9/11, I'm not sure which one's my favorite, but the plane not hitting the Pentagon, I'm just wondering how the hell...
Especially because we have images of the plane hitting the Pentagon,
hitting the
right?
Pentagon. Yeah.
Right? So
you got to be, as you said, a whole lot of crazy to pick up on these conspiracy theories. Like my other favorite is the steel in the building couldn't possibly melt. And maybe you might need to do a little research on that.
Yeah. Excuse me. When two giant planes filled with fuel are rammed into 2 giant buildings, creating massive fires. Excuse me, but I think a whole lot of melting is going to occur. It doesn't take a rocket science to figure out that this is not that difficult to figure out how this could go down. But yeah, this 9/11 sort of conspiracy theories or trutherism, this stuff exists online. We've seen it throughout all the years we've been doing this, right, Bill? You've seen this stuff. You've seen this stuff on social media and elsewhere. We've seen it in some of the comments at Longword Journal even. Years ago I wrote up part of Nasser al-Wahishi. He was the former aide-de-camp to Osama bin Laden, and posthumously Al-Qaeda started publishing a series from Wahishi explaining sort of the 9/11, the thinking behind 9/11 on Al-Qaeda's behalf. And it was I mean, first of all, you have plenty of evidence before that Al Qaeda was responsible. But I remember some of the comments I got on that piece from people like, well, how do you know that Wahishi actually wrote this or said this? I mean, like, what? So Al Qaeda now, Al Qaeda's what? Covering up for the CIA or something? I mean, this isn't even a logical sort of theory. But this type of stuff is out there, and there's probably, I would say, there's probably the amount of this stuff, regardless of my skepticism regarding the efficacy of Russian disinformation. I think this stuff's probably growing. That congressional nominee I was talking about who's running that race in Georgia, she has also dabbled in QAnon, which is also this just absolutely noxious conspiracy theory about how Washington works. You and I have plenty of problems with how Washington works, but
right,
folks,
we don't need to introduce insane conspiracy theories to understand.
Yeah, you don't need Q to explain the corruption and rot in Washington, right? I mean, there's a lot of problems in Washington. I don't need some, mythical Q to explain this, And so, a lot of times, I'm reminded as we started diving into this topic, Christopher Hitchens, the deceased Christopher Hitchens, used to emphasize the fact that humans, Homo sapiens, are pattern-seeking mammals, that our brains are sort of hardwired to find patterns in the world because that's what helps us make sense of it, helps us make sense of what's going on around us. And from an evolutionary perspective, that has a lot of advantages in terms of, when you think back to our earliest iterations of our species, finding things that we can eat, things that are poisonous, things that are not poisonous, things that are beneficial for us, things that are not. So that sort of learning process and finding these basic patterns and rhythms in life sort of help our species survive and grow and spread over time. But the sort of the pattern-seeking part of our brains can kind of run amok, and basically people that don't want to take the time or don't have the time to look into different issues, and they just want to sort of see a pattern where there is none. They want to sort of have some sort of organizing framework for world events, for a world that can be chaotic and confusing and violent and scary. And these types of theories can sort of simplify things for people, for the true believers, and it sort of gives them an explanation for how the world works. And I remember, Bill, we were talking before you got on, you said something about how you were explaining to one of your daughters the difference between conspiracy theories and conspiracies. Maybe share some of those thoughts, because I think that's sort of, maybe there's a congressional candidate or two who could use that thinking right now to use that lecture.
Yeah, certainly. And, it goes to look, and this is something that since the advent of the internet, I think is really blossomed. I remember first being introduced to some of the more crazier conspiracy theories and the late 1990s, when getting on the internet and the moon landing and alien abductions and things. And I was just kind of like reading it as a lark. But now it's become, that was fine when the internet was something for adults to look at when they're at their computers. But now, your kids are looking at this. And I remember my one daughter was looking at this, and, it's probably in her early teens, right? And was kind of curious about conspiracy theories. So I had to explain to her, look, there's conspiracies happen. We could point to them in history. I mean, there's actual criminal charges for conspiracy. They exist. And but the difference, there's logic behind them. The conspiracy theories tend to be just completely off the wall. They tend to there's not much. That's what always gets me about this. We mentioned, Tom, that you're looking for pattern seeking, but it's like pattern seeking, as I think you even said this, gone amok. It's the opposite of logic when you put these. It's an attempt to simplify complex conspiracies that or complex events, as you said. And so it took a little time for me to talk to my daughter about this, to explain the difference, explain what Occam's razor is. The simplest explanation is more likely the actual explanation, that a lot of these conspiracy theories require such, if they're so secretive, if they're so pervasive, then why does everyone know about all of the greatest conspiracies out there?
Yeah, and it's one of the funnier aspects of this is that probably the most successful conspiracies in the history of humanity we don't know about, right? Because that's why they're successful. Yeah, that's what makes the real conspiracy work. But to connect this back to the topic of this podcast and the topic of our work and what we've done all these years, as I see these Russian proxy sites spreading 9/11 conspiracy theories and other sites spread this type of stuff, I'm reminded that Osama bin Laden, you could see in the files captured in his compound, he was mildly or not so mildly perturbed by the fact that people were trying to take away Al-Qaeda's credit for 9/11. That he basically was upset that they were, how can anybody believe this? We did this. What do what's wrong with you people?
Tom, on that point, isn't there? Correct me if I'm wrong. I remember watching a video with him, and I believe it was a Kuwaiti cleric, and they were sitting down talking about 9/11 and how he talked about how if they could kill 30,000, 300,000, or 3 million, he would have done it, but they was happy with the results of 9/11. Am I wrong about that? There's a video out there. I remember seeing that on
there's multiple
CNN.
pieces of evidence of Bin Laden talking about this. I think it's indisputable. And you can see multiple times he gets into it. But the thing about
the conspiracy, that would have to be the guy admits to it. The guy's the head of Al Qaeda, but then Al Qaeda didn't do it. So what was that?
The other part of the 9/11 conspiracy theory was, if you think about our contested political system here in the U.S., let's say the Bush administration really did this for some nefarious reason, which is absolutely insanely offensive. Right, but let's just say that the Bush administration did this, which is one version of it, to justify wars overseas or something like that. You don't think the Democrats would have taken advantage of that in 2004 and seized upon any real evidence of that to defeat Bush and send him off to jail forevermore? And he'd be in a prison of the Guantanamos at this point in terms of maximum security prisons. I mean, it's ludicrous on its face that in our society that something like that would would basically happen, and political rivals wouldn't take advantage of it. I mean, certainly John Kerry in 2004 went after Bush in every way he could have, and there was some dabbling in this stuff with Fahrenheit 9/11 and other things that took place at that point, which was sort of inexcusable. I think some of this, the Bush administration sort of knew something beforehand. I find all that to be very stupid. I mean, you look back at the PDB from 2001, August 6, 2001, which was warning that Bin Laden was determined to strike in the U.S. It didn't have any specific details about something like this. Should the Bush administration have taken the Al-Qaeda threat more seriously? Absolutely. Should they have done more to sort of be on top of it? Sure. But the idea that they sort of knew something big like this was coming, it's just not the case. And the other thing is that, when you look back, it's easy, as the cliche expression it goes, 2020 is always hindsight. And going back through this, you could say, well, you missed these certain details that form a real pattern leading up to the event. The thing is that there are all sorts of details like that, or facts that don't actually lead up to anything as well in other ways. And when you look back at the history of Al-Qaeda's plotting and Jihadist plotting against the U.S., there's so many thwarted, failed plots. It gets very difficult to figure out what actually got to a serious level and which wasn't, which is sort of looking at all this. But it also reminded me, Bill, this is one of the things we've certainly, both of us have come across numerous times. And this is the interesting twist in this story, is that in terms of conspiracy thinking, Osama bin Laden was a conspiracy theorist.
Yeah.
Al-Qaeda is, to a large degree, founded on a conspiracy theory. Modern jihadism is. And that conspiracy theory is this idea that there's this Zionist-Crusader alliance that's conspiring against Muslims at all times. And if you just have a cursory knowledge of modern history the last, 45, 50 years, let's say, that ain't true. That's certainly not even close to true. The ultimate irony there is that the U.S. backed the Mujahideen in Afghanistan against the Soviets, an effort that was certainly pro-Muslim or on the side of the Muslims in that conflict, and actually redounded to the benefit of the jihadis. And it's something that Jalal and Haqqani and bin Laden and others didn't, even though Haqqani's benefit from American support. The jihadists didn't want to give America any credit for that. It just showed that they basically have to twist history. And so you can point to other examples, ejecting Saddam Hussein from Kuwait, and preventing Saddam Hussein from marching on Saudi Arabia. Again, U.S. didn't get any credit from that in jihadi circles, and said it was all sort of part of some conspiracy to basically justify U.S. intervention. Bosnia and Herzegovina, another clear example where, the U.S. intervened on the side of local Muslims. And by the way, in that conflict, bin Laden had to come up with a conspiracy theory for, the U.S. delayed arms to make sure more Muslims were killed or something like that. I mean, he had to come up with all sorts of conspiracy theories that way. But the bottom line is that this type of conspiracy, so even though you and I, rightfully so, deride this type of thinking and are dismissive of it in terms of the logic of it, it does have a disturbing impact on the world, because you can see, with modern jihadism, you can see a distinct conspiracy theory element to it. And you can see, in terms of how they view the world and how they organize the world to justify their jihad and what they're trying to do in their terrorism. So this type of stuff isn't going to go away anytime soon. It's a big problem. I was wondering if you had any thoughts about the role that conspiracy theory thinking plays in jihadi world. I mean, to me, it's a part of this. I don't think American leaders have really communicated really that often that this is the way these guys view things.
Yeah, I mean, I think we, as you noted, I mean, it really all is founded on one big conspiracy that the United States, or the West, is out to annihilate the Muslim world. And I think that all of our interactions, I mean, you could argue at times U.S. is pro-Israel versus against the Palestinian cause or whatnot. But even the United States, France, and Britain sided with the Egyptians against the Israelis in the Suez Canal crisis. I mean, for goodness sake, you have, we can sit here. There's numerous instances where, when the Gaddafi regime was overthrown, who did the United States support in Libya? So I find, and I just, Tom, I'm just going to admit, talking about these things, I'm always at a loss for words. To me, some of these things seem so stupid that it almost insults my intelligence to have to discuss an actual conspiracy theory. I mean, it's like when I remember earlier in a previous episode, we had to talk about, was the Islamic State or Al-Qaeda in Iraq really part of Al-Qaeda before Zawahiri ejected it? It's such a stupid thing. Of course it was. I mean, all the evidence is there to back it up. And yet here we are. We still have to do things like discuss why conspiracy theories are stupid. And, but, as far as to get back to your initial question about, the jihadist use of conspiracy theories, I mean, we've seen this in things like, oh God, I'm losing his name. The American, Adam, right?
Adam Gadon, yeah.
Adam Gadon, that's right. He repeated conspiracy theories constantly in his statements. He would talk about, race conspiracies in the United States. It was almost like, it was like they picked the stupidest person on the planet because he was an American and could speak English and get on a camera. And he'd spout off conspiracy after conspiracy. I think Al-Qaeda has actually improved on that front a lot. But even today, you have things like the Taliban, one of our favorite conspiracies that is ongoing right now with the Taliban. They accuse the United States and the Afghan government of backing the Islamic State to fight against the Taliban. And kill civilians. I mean, just think about that. The U.S. signed a deal with the Taliban, and part of that is to rely on the Taliban as an effective counterterrorism partner, and that so-called effective counterterrorism partner is spouting a conspiracy theory about how we're backing the Islamic State. So, yeah, I just think that we're not going to see an end to conspiracy theories in our world or in the jihadist world anytime soon.
The other thing about that conspiracy theory with the Taliban is that, there was some evidence the U.S. at least looked the other way in eastern Afghanistan when the Taliban and Al-Qaeda were mounting their offensive against ISIS, didn't launch airstrikes against the Taliban and Al-Qaeda positions to allow them to do that. And some U.S. military officials have said, there was some sort of level of indirect support of some degree there to allow the Taliban and Al-Qaeda to go after ISIS because the U.S. military wasn't going to defeat ISIS in eastern Afghanistan, so they wanted the jihadi rivals to go after him. So the irony there is that, or the twist there is that while the Taliban is blaming us or blaming the U.S. for sponsoring ISIS in Afghanistan, the U.S. is actually basically looking the other way and sort of saying, that a boy, go get him, and sort of happy to have the Taliban go do that work for us.
Yeah, and even providing airstrikes against them.
Supposedly do that work for us, but I know that the enemy of our enemy is not always our friend.
Exactly, and this is actually one conspiracy that I don't think the Taliban actually believe it. I think they use this conspiracy as a propaganda point because enough of them have been on that theater in the east in Nangarhar to see what's happening.
ISIS also is one of those groups that is always the subject of conspiracy theories in the jihadi world, much more so than it's. ISIS is always derivative of some other bad actor. It's never. This is sort of what you and I get a little annoyed at too, because in Syria, ISIS was supposedly in cahoots with the Assad regime against the supposedly moderate opposition and was basically working to discredit the opposition in the war. It was some bizarre, elaborate scheme in which, Assad and ISIS didn't really fight, according to some pundits. And you and I know, look at that, and that's a theory that actually got a lot of salience, got a lot of currency in Washington. People were pitching. You and I were documenting ISIS and Assad fighting each other at the time, thinking, what the heck are you guys talking about? They're fighting, by the way, that's part of the ISIS story in Syria right now, is they're fighting right now, as we're recording this, in Syria to this day. ISIS captured oil and gas fields from the Assad regime. Those oil and gas fields were built and developed to serve civilian populations in the Assad-controlled territories. And so it's sort of unsurprising that ISIS would turn around and sell those natural resources back to the Assad regime that had originally owned them. But that was portrayed as, other than be sort of this bizarre twist in this war, a war economy sort of functioning as, this sort of sales were functioning as part of a war economy. And by the way, ISIS sells oil to everybody,
right.
In the area. But anyway, but instead of being part of a war economy, that was portrayed as some scheme by Assad to stand up ISIS and give it funds to keep fighting and everything. And so it just becomes ISIS in particular. You could see the conspiratorial thinking around it in the West and elsewhere, even where this type of thinking gained currency, and it really doesn't stand up to muster when you get down to the facts.
Yeah, I think that might have been one of the more frustrating conspiracy theories over the past decade. You had some supposed serious analysts pushing this, and, it all stemmed from the desire to take out Assad at all costs instead of just making the case that, he's a horrible actor. Wow, we all know that. But it was so maddening when we were documenting this. The Assad regime expended significant resources to try to defend eastern Syria, those remote areas, towns like Palmyra, that was like key hubs, and they had some major bases out there that the Islamic State overran, and yet, and were executing Syrian soldiers, on video, and yet somehow that was an Assad plot, an Assad conspiracy. And I guess that's why it makes it a conspiracy, because it's just
it makes a conspiracy theory.
It makes it a conspiracy theory, correct.
Not a conspiracy.
Yeah, right. I mean, Assad would have to be absolutely, completely craven to do something like that. He's crazy, but he's not that crazy.
Well, it also doesn't make any sense, right?
It doesn't make sense,
The point is, if you look back at the provincial capitals that fell, the jihadis played a big role in the fall of Raqqa. There was this theory there was just a free Syrian army that captured Raqqa and then ISIS took it away from them. Well, no. If you go back to the whole history of Raqqa falling, you can see the jihadis, Nusra at the time, Arar Sham and others played a leading role in that battle. And you can see elsewhere in Raqqa that the predecessor to ISIS and then ISIS battled Assad's forces. Same story in Deir ez-Zor, where you can have the jihadis playing a large role. Of course, Idlib fell to a jihadi-led coalition at the time led by al-Nusra Front and its allies, which at the time was part of Al-Qaeda. So if Assad was playing this game, I'm going to manipulate the jihadis to discredit the rest of the opposition, it doesn't make any sense when you're handing over territory to the jihadis and your biggest losses are coming to the jihadis.
And at this point in time, too, Tom, people were questioning whether he was going to survive. I mean, he had Damascus, some places in the southwest and places on the West Coast. The jihadists were close to marching on Damascus at that point in time. And it was only the Iranian and Russian support which really turned things around, particularly the Russian involvement in when we used Air Force and advisors and even Russian paramilitaries entering combat. That's what turned the tide. I mean, he would have to be absolutely out of his skull to have had the Islamic State intentionally kill his soldiers, which
Islamic State and Al-Qaeda and other jihadis,
exactly.
Right. So all these different groups. Yeah, I mean, none of this is defense of Assad. I mean, you and I know the Assad story well. I mean, you were in Iraq when the Assad regime was sending jihadis across the border from Syria and Iraq to go after our guys, our troops, and go after Iraqis, suicide bombers. I mean, Assad was in fact in cahoots with the jihadis during that time, during the height of the Iraq War. That's not a conspiracy theory. There's plenty of evidence along those lines. But as you said early on, and we documented early on, what happened was that pipeline, the tail of that pipeline, turned around and came back at Assad himself. Just as, to his credit, General Petraeus warned Assad of that at the time. Yep. Said that this is something that you're going to pay for eventually. That this thing is going to, and it did. It ultimately turned against the Assad regime. The jihadis ISIS and Al-Qaeda and other affiliated groups ended up basically going after the Assad regime. Now, it doesn't mean there aren't, sort of tactical things that you can see happen on the battlefield. There are other things that happen in the meantime. But this idea, basically what we object to is this idea that Assad is sort of the Wizard of Oz, right? The man behind the curtain, pulling the strings on ISIS, which was one of the, or on the earliest versions on Nusra, which is one of the earliest versions of the theory, which is just nonsense.
Yeah, I mean, look, that raid, I believe, against Abu Ghadia, right, who was the head of that tail network that was in eastern Syria. I mean, we killed him in 2008, and that's when Petraeus made the warning and all of that. The Assad regime objected to the U.S. cross-border raid inside Syria to kill Abu Ghadia and others. And then, less than 3 years, those guys turned on him like a rabid dog.
But, so the bottom line is that conspiracy thinking, or sort of distilling it in this term, as you alluded to this, Bill, that the pattern seeking there is you had people that wanted to get rid of Assad and justify regime change, which is understandable morally. I mean, Assad is the worst actor in Syria, I mean, in terms of killing and everything else. But that becomes the default mode, and so then the pattern-seeking mammal in us then goes and tries to cook the books basically on the Syrian war to say, well, it's all just about Assad, get Assad, And some of the worst analysis we've seen sort of took off from that point, unfortunately. But we see other stuff like that too. You could see other sort of examples through time like that. But one of the interesting things about all this too is the phrase I came up with called disconnecting the dots to describe sort of the prevalent thinking in counterterrorism circles on this stuff. And this is sort of the opposite of pattern seeking, in which we had basically people just, sort of describing Al-Qaeda as loosely affiliated and there was no real cohesive network. And then, you see some dabble with this idea with ISIS, despite the fact that there's all this evidence to this day that both maintain cohesive networks. And this is something we've sort of battled over time, or combated over time, because, you can go too far into, it's not a conspiracy theory to think, when you see these groups saluting Ayman al-Zawahiri and before him Osama bin Laden around the globe, that maybe there's more to it, that maybe they actually mean it, that maybe it isn't just rhetoric, maybe it isn't just words, that they actually are part of a cohesive network. But yet we've seen that in U.S. government circles, there was always this drive to disconnect the dots in terms of doing this type of analysis. And it's still a prevalent way of viewing things, I would say, right, Bill? I mean, you still come across that. You come across that in the Taliban, Al-Qaeda. I mean, there's no evidence, so.
Yep. Yeah, it's, instead of, it's the opposite of disconnecting the dots, would be either improperly connecting the dots or manufacturing dots to connect. I mean, I think that's what a conspiracy is in these cases. And yeah, we unfortunately, and the funny thing about the Assad thing too, well, nothing's funny about any of this, but look, it's either supposedly intelligence analysts actually believe this conspiracy theory that Assad stood up the Islamic State and all these jihadists, or they cynically push the theory just to get their foreign policy goals. Neither speaks well to them. Either they're stupid or they're jumping on a conspiracy theory for opportunistic means. And in the case of what we know with Afghanistan, the disconnect the dots on Al-Qaeda and the Taliban and what the Taliban's goals are for Afghanistan, which is, of course, to reestablish the Islamic Emirate. In the case of that, that's intentional, right? The people are ignoring those linkages because they have a foreign policy goal of withdrawing from Afghanistan at all costs. So they'll ignore the facts to fit their policy.
Yeah, and another example of this, I don't want to get too far down this rabbit hole because I keep teasing it. We are going to do a separate podcast on this, but the issue of Iran and Al-Qaeda, right?
Yeah.
In this relationship. What's interesting about this is you and I, me in particular, I've been the subject of sort of a I would say a conspiracy theory of sorts that basically that we're only interested in this relationship to justify war with Iran or regime change with Iran. And this is only something coming from so-called neocons, of which neither you nor I are neocons, by the way. Neither one of us have ever ascribed to being. Nope. I don't think you can look back at anything I've written or said, and if you think I'm a neocon, first of all, I don't think you can define neocon. Neocon itself has become a conspiratorial word, right? It's a stand-in basically for whatever you don't like in the foreign policy world that's perceived to be interventionist, so there's sort of this whole neocon, view of things, which I think there are very few people who actually could be described as neocon these days. But in any event, so neocons is abused word. It's a caricature. It's a conspiratorial word. But there's this whole idea that neocons wanted to make up, just as they made up this idea that Saddam was in cahoots with Al-Qaeda, they want to make up the idea that Iran's in cahoots with Al-Qaeda to justify war. Every link in that chain is broken. Every link in that, none of that is true. When it comes to Iran, Al-Qaeda, one of the things we always point out is that it was the Obama administration, even as President Obama was desperate to cut a deal with the Iranians, that documented Iran's collusion with Al-Qaeda in a series of official terrorist designations. Both the Treasury Department and State Department came out with this official series of designations and statements documenting this. And I always point out that the backbone of what I say about this comes from those official U.S. government designations and statements, and also comes from sources like the 9/11 Commission report, district court documents, that sort of thing. All official stuff, right? All, in some cases, even Al-Qaeda internal testimonies, that kind of thing. All, basically bedrock sources. But you can see that there's this drive in U.S. politics, in particular in policymaking circles in and around Washington. I know when I've talked about Iran and Al-Qaeda, there's always this snickering sort of conspiracy theory ascribed to it, as if this is only about somehow justifying war with Iran. And of course, that's just bullshit, right? I mean, you and I know it's bullshit. If you actually listen to anything I say, you know that's not even close to true. And basically, it shows that people aren't really capable of dealing with facts, or dealing with facts that contradict their biases. It's interesting. I'm watching all this stuff. I watched the UN reporting that's come out over the last couple of years. You and I have documented that and read through those reports. And you have both the UN and the State Department now talking about Saif al-Adil and Abu Muhammad al-Masri having playing a managerial role within Al-Qaeda's global network from inside Iran. And those are just the latest examples of it. Is the UN Security Council team of experts that's writing those reports, are they just trying to cook up a war with Iran? I mean, it's just all stupid, right? But this is the thing. It's sort of this thinking, this conspiratorial thinking. What I'm trying, this is a long-winded way of saying, it does impact things in ways that sort of you wouldn't expect, right? That people sort of inject this sort of conspiratorial way of viewing the world. In their own political or policy making or ideological reasons, they sort of paper over things that are maybe too complex for them to understand.
Yeah, again, back to get to their desire to the policy goal. I mean, and to be clear about you and I mean, I think we're both. I know neither of us wants to start another war when we can't win ones we're currently involved with. I mean, we have very serious misgivings. Tom and I have very serious misgivings about the use of U.S. force overseas because of how poorly we've managed and executed the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan in particular, but also in places like in Libya has been an absolute disaster. That doesn't mean we can't have a clear-eyed view on what the nature of the enemy is. Just because we're saying Al-Qaeda and Iran cooperate doesn't mean we're saying that the next step isn't we should go to war with Iran. It means we need to set our policy in line with the facts. That's all that you and I ever ask for. We don't advocate for war for any,
I don't want to get too far. Like I said, I don't want to get too far down this rabbit hole because I want to save it for this episode because I want to walk people through some of my experiences in this regard because I think it's kind of funny actually. There's basically a conspiracy theory around our role in getting the Bin Laden files released, that this was all about justifying war with Iran. Yeah, remember?
Exactly.
We'll talk about that. This is all idiocy. Yeah. We'll talk about it though because I think it's worth people understanding how stupid it really is. When you actually understand this stuff.
Yeah. One of my favorite conspiracies, Tom, is that we're paid agents of the Indians, and the Israelis.
Well, the CIA one was
the
one I used to like.
CIA.
Yeah, the CIA.
And I'm always, where's my damn check? I just want my paychecks from these people. I guess I'm just working pro bono for the last 17 years.
Yeah. Which, by the way, that's probably, I'll say this. I'll say two things. One, I gamed the whole Iran Al-Qaeda stuff out. Again, I'm not going to belabor the point because we're going to do an episode on this, but all the way back in 2007, and you can see what I wrote about at the time. I said, look, there's a real issue here, folks. Whether you just read the 9/11 Commission report, and there's a real issue here. But if you go through these official sources, there's a real issue here. But I said it. I wrote this now 13 years ago, more than 13 years ago. I said, look, this doesn't mean that we should go to war with Iran over this. I mean, I think a war with Iran would be disastrous because we don't know what we're doing. That was 2007. I mean, I had gamed all this out back then, way even before then, because I actually wrote that in 2006. It wasn't published in 2007. So it's just stupid. But this type of conspiratorial thinking, still has currency. But the second thing I'll say is that when it comes to the fact that we're not paid by the CIA or the Indians, I'll inject once again here. I'm sure Phil's going to love this. We're going to actually ask you guys for money at some point for paying for the podcast, for other stuff, and buying merchandise and everything else. And maybe we can come up with some funny conspiratorial, T-shirt or something, that play off of this episode, which is talking about, the fact that we're just keeping our eyes on the enemies and the jihadis, really don't have any other motive than other just trying to figure out what the heck's going on. And that's, something to do in and of itself. That's the point, is that, part of what I want to talk about in a future episode too is bifurcating sort of the way you view the world from what you want to do about it. Because a lot of times, if you can become myopically obsessed with something, I think that's what happened with Iraq and Saddam Hussein. Some policymakers did become myopically obsessed with Saddam Hussein to the point that they didn't see the rest of the picture, and that's what led to the Iraq War. And that doesn't mean there weren't any justifications for it. I don't agree with all the anti-war arguments. But you got to be careful about how you view the world and how you view these things, and sort of what emphasis you put on it, and figuring and also understanding that what you want to do about something, is a different issue from what actually is going on. Yes, the two are related, but there's not a one-for-one overlap. And conspiracy theorists and conspiracy thinking doesn't allow for any of that nuance, right? I mean, it just basically wants to boil everything down into these very simplified narratives to understand the world, and sort of paper over all the complexities and problems and the uncertainty that you have to deal with.
Yeah. Look, facts and policy are two different things. I mean, you and I are all about the facts, and if you can't get the facts right, you can't get the policy right, and that's just all there is to it. You just can't create facts in order to craft a policy. That's going down the conspiratorial.
No, we see that quite often, though. We do. Basically, people are only looking at the facts that they think sort of justify their policies. But all right, I think that's enough on conspiracy theories. This is sort of off the cuff type of conversation about this. It's just something that sort of popped up on our radars for various reasons this week, so we thought we'd talk about it. But let's get into something more concrete, which is that the Afghan government is releasing, or is in the process of releasing, these 400 Taliban prisoners, the remaining Taliban prisoners that were their release was negotiated by the U.S. without the Afghan government's consent as part of this February 29th withdrawal deal that was agreed to in Doha. And Bill, I know you've been tracking this, and maybe give us some thoughts on what's going on here, what the Afghan government's doing and what they should be doing, and how they're sort of, what people are not thinking about.
Yeah, absolutely. And, to set the stage. So that part of a big part of that deal in February is in order for the Taliban to negotiate with an intra-Afghan team, not the Afghan government, mind you, but an intra-Afghan negotiating team, which is very nebulous. It basically means elements of society and the government isn't going to dominate that side of the talks.
It basically waters down the Afghan government's legitimacy, because from the get-go it says
to it,
yeah,
but not the main driver, because the Taliban refuses to directly negotiate. So before that had to happen, the Afghan government had to release 5,000 Taliban prisoners in exchange for 1,000 prisoners being held by the Taliban. Already an imbalanced deal, right? So this is a deal, remember, that was signed by the Afghan government, not by the Afghan government, just by the U.S. and the Taliban. The Taliban refused to let the Afghan government being a party to the deal. Well, Tom, I'm going to use this word, even though I think you're going to disagree with me. I think the Afghan government now has officially cuckolded itself to the deal, the U.S. Taliban deal. It has agreed to release all 5,000 of those prisoners. There was they released 46,000, or 4,600, I'm sorry. And then there was a debate over the last 400. The Afghan government called together a Loya Jirga, which is basically a grand council of Afghan notables. It's like cross-section of society. By the way, that's what they want this negotiating team to look like. That's what the Taliban wants it to look like. 3,200 people gather to discuss the release of 400 Taliban prisoners. And at the end of the meeting, they agreed. They did officially cuckold themselves to that U.S. Taliban deal. And here's a breakdown. Now, so there was some debate.
I would just say the Afghan government basically became servile to the deal. Basically,
Okay, servile's
the deal.
fine.
Yeah.
Sure.
I mean, I think
they're raising the child of the U.S. Taliban negotiations. I think
they basically.
I think my word does work.
They acquiesced to the, They gave into, they surrendered to the terms of the deal.
I like my word better, Tom. I'm sorry. I'm going to stick with it.
It made me cringe a couple times, but let's just do surrendered and go from there, okay? So.
No, wait. And so there was a debate over who were they, right? Who were these 400? Why was this such a big issue? You had, and then Afghan news agencies was able to get information, and here's what they found out. They found 156 were sentenced to death. We weren't told why. 105 are accused of murder, 34 for kidnapping that led to murder, so basically accessory to murder via kidnapping, 51 drug smugglers, 44 of them are blacklisted by the Afghan government and its allies, very likely the United States. And by the way, if you're blacklisted by the U.S., there's usually some type of al-Qaeda tie related to that. 6 accused of other... No.
That cannot be. That cannot be.
That's my conspiracy theory anyway, and I'll stick with it.
Yeah, it's impossible. That's impossible. That's not even a theory. But anyway.
6 accused of other crimes and 4 accused of unspecified crimes, so whatever that means. So this seems to be the worst of the worst here, and apparently one of those being talked about being released. Now, he's in U.S. custody, so I'm not sure how he came up with his name, Haji Bashir Narazi. He was a Taliban financier and drug lord. The U.S. arrested him in 2005. He may have been turned over to the Afghans. I'm not sure. It's a little fuzzy on that, what his status is. So now the Afghan government, the head of the Roggio organizing committee, he claimed that there's no foreign individuals within those 400 Taliban prisoners. He does note that some were sentenced to death and whatnot. So, but here's what happens when the Roggio issues basically its recommendations. One of the things that they say about the 400 prisoners, this is a quote, they must be handed over to their countries with valid guarantees. Well, that would make them foreign fighters, right? If they're being handed over to foreign countries. If there's no foreigners involved in these 400, why is the Roggio saying, well, the ones that are foreign have to be handed over? So Kim Dozier notes that a lot of these, in an article at Time, she notes that a lot of these,
or some of them,
are tied to Al-Qaeda. That's probably getting back to those 44 who were on the blacklist, but some of them may also have other Al-Qaeda. You don't have to be on the blacklist to be tied to Al-Qaeda. A while back, I remember documenting what the U.S. military used to call dual-hatted Al-Qaeda Taliban commanders, and I don't believe any of those guys. Actually, one of them, the Aminullah, who's the head of the Taliban's Peshawar Shura, he's a dual-hatted Al-Qaeda and Taliban leader. He runs something called the Ganj Madrasa in Peshawar. It's an Al-Qaeda training camp, and he supports the Taliban. He's the head of the Taliban's Peshawar Shura, so that's as dual-hatted as you get. But he's the only dual-hatted one that I know of that's been designated, so a bunch of them are out there.
And by the way, the Taliban has worked to get these dual-hatted guys freed in the past. So it was late 2019, for example. You'll remember that Abdul Rashid Baluch, who's a U.S. designated global terrorist, especially designated global terrorist, he was designated. He's a Taliban figure. He served according to the U.S. government's designation, he served as a Taliban liaison officer to Al-Qaeda and was responsible for planning meetings between the Taliban senior leadership and Al-Qaeda members in Karachi, Pakistan. He is one of the Taliban leaders or members that was freed in exchange for 3 Indian engineers who were kidnapped. And this exchange happened in 2019. So these are the types of figures. This exchange happened even as the U.S. was talking to the Taliban, negotiating with them. The Taliban was still interested in getting these dual-hatted figures out, or these sort of liaison figures out. So this is not something that's new. This is something that basically
ongoing.
Yeah, unsurprising. But here's the point, right? We don't have a list of all these guys, so we don't even know the names of all these individuals who are put out or biographies on them or anything else. There's all sorts of missing evidence right now about who these guys are that are being freed. As you said, the Afghan press has come up with some detailed or summary statistics on it, according to them, of who these guys are. They certainly sound bad, but we don't have the specifics. And, shouldn't we know if some of these guys are Al-Qaeda guys who are being freed as part of this deal, a deal that is being trumpeted by U.S. officials as leading to supposed break between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda? Well, if the Taliban is getting Al-Qaeda guys out of jail, What does that say about, yet again, what does that say about the whole premise of this deal?
They didn't just stick these guys' name on a list and ask them to be freed. Like in the case of Baluch, right? Like that was a campaign. I mean, they held out Indian hostages in order to get him released. They actively sought his release and others as well. So yeah, this is, but yep, this is supposed to be our effective counterterrorism partner. Now, why, in the bigger picture, the Afghans the Afghan government's trying to cut this deal, trying to negotiate with the Taliban for reasons you and I can't understand, right? The Taliban has been extremely clear. It will not accept a silly ministerial position. That's its own words. Because after fighting so many years, sacrificing so many years, it insists that the Afghan government is corrupt. It is illegitimate, that the Afghan constitution is illegitimate. Both of those entities are un-Islamic, which is the biggest insult that the Taliban could hurl at anyone, really, right? There's an entire movement based on its religion and on its view towards Allah. So if you're un-Islamic, that's as bad as it gets to the Taliban. So we know it's not going to do this. Why is the Afghan government expending all of this political capital, all of this energy on trying to do something that's not going to work? I mean, really, what it ought to be doing is it should be preparing for what happens when the U.S. leaves, because the U.S. is leaving. The allies are leaving. We're going to be down to around 4,600 troops. And let's face it, at that point, even General Miller at one point said somewhere below 8,000, and really we can't effectively run counterterrorism operations. So we're going to be down at 4,600. General Miller, of course, being the commander of U.S. forces and resolute support in Afghanistan. So, at some point, it's just not going to be tenable to stay. And yet the Afghan government's wasting all this energy, all this capital, and trying to talk to the Taliban. What it really needs to be doing is preparing for the worst, preparing for what's going to happen next. The Taliban's going to take these 5,000 guys. The Afghan government's demanding that the Taliban ensure that these 5,000 don't return to the battlefield.
Yeah, good luck with that.
Yeah, and the Taliban has said absolutely nothing, because you know what else the Taliban did before this loyal jirga got together? It denounced it. It said it's not legitimate. It's something dominated by the Afghan government, and therefore anything it says is not worth anything. So we have these demands being put on the Taliban by the Afghan government, but there's no enforcement. And there's just nothing. So Tom and I have been talking, for a while now, saying the Afghan government really needs to get its house in order, figure out who its real allies, foreign allies are, who's going to fund them, who's going to provide them with weapon and ammunition and everything it needs to fight the Taliban.
What ground they can defend,
exactly. Consolidate its positions and how to carry the fight on against, because this fight's going to continue. The Taliban are using this negotiation process to run out the clock. The U.S. doesn't have to, isn't going to leave, or the U.S. doesn't, the plan isn't the U.S. leaves once the Taliban has a peace deal with the Afghan government. It's once negotiations start, the Taliban's fulfilled its part of the U.S. deal. So the Taliban
that speaks to how weak this deal really was. Yeah. I mean, the only criteria the Taliban have to meet is they just have to sit down with the Afghan government and talk. And
not even the Afghan government.
The intra-Afghan talks, right? Intra-Afghan talks, which the Khalilzad and others are portraying as the Afghan government, but actually is a broader sort of. But it will include the Afghan government. The Afghan government
yes,
will
but
include that.
They're not driving at the talks. They can't walk away.
They're not the legitimate sovereign actor here, and so basically. The point is that they don't even have to, talks don't even have to lead to an outcome, any outcome. They could just as long as they occur in some form, you'll have Khalilzad and Pompeo check that box and say, look, we're all good here, and we're out. And this is all the point to all this, as we've said. You've heard me say this over and over again. You've heard Bill say versions of this. There was no reason to absolve and legitimize the Taliban like this, absolve it of its ongoing terrorist ties to Al-Qaeda and affiliated groups, or legitimize them and treat them as a legitimate governing actor or a legitimate negotiating partner to get out of Afghanistan. The U.S. could have gotten out without any of this, right? And so none of this was necessary to get out, right? And you have a lot of people who just want to get out, okay? You didn't need to do any of this. And all this has done is really strengthen the Taliban's hand in various ways, and we don't see any evidence that the Taliban is changing its stripes or is going to change its political goals after all these years or anything else, right? There's nothing, at this point. In fact, they're just springing Al-Qaeda guys from prison.
All the while denying that Al-Qaeda even has a presence in the country.
Right.
So, this is as bad. We've said it a million times, and we'll say it again. It's as bad a deal as possible. And lest we, again, be accused of being warmongers, Tom and I, look, I think we've come to the conclusion that it's time to get out of Afghanistan, not because it's the smartest thing to do or that's the best strategy to take against Al-Qaeda. It's because there's no support for it here in the United States anymore. And the worst thing I think a country can do is remain in a war that has no popular support. However, we need to be clear-eyed about what we're leaving behind.
It's just a very slow motion loss. I mean, I wrote in 2018 that the war was over and the U.S. had lost this. Let's not sugarcoat it. And this thing is just taking forever to cement the loss. It's like the final 2 minutes of the game are going on for about a decade. It's crazy.
Both the Taliban and the U.S. have like 500 timeouts each. It's like watching the end of a basketball game.
That's a better analogy. Yeah, the basketball game.
And
trying
just
to shoot the 1-and-1, and then it becomes exactly. And then they shoot the 1-and-1, and then they get the 2 free throws. The Taliban is just lapping up the free throws right now. That's what all this is. That's what all this is. So. But I mean, all this does, they have, even though they have all sorts of conspiratorial thinking, the Taliban does, I've seen when it comes to the Afghan war, I've seen all sorts of conspiracy thinking over the years, that the U.S. just, the war machine just wants to be in Afghanistan to keep it going. And that's part of, we talked about this previously in an episode about the endless wars rhetoric. That's part of what I object to in that. I mean, you can be critical of the Afghan war and think we need to get out, but it's not like the U.S. is keeping the war going. The U.S. and the Afghan government have pleaded with the Taliban for a ceasefire. They pleaded for It's the U.S. that said over and over again, U.S. military generals, U.S. politicians, U.S. political figures, the president, everybody has said they want to end the quote-unquote war. That's not, it's just the bottom line is the jihadis keep fighting. So you can want to end the war all you want. They're not going to end their jihad, right? And they'll invent all sorts of conspiracy theories to keep it going if they have to, in fact, So
Absolutely. And my favorite conspiracy theory is Afghanistan is all about a war about oil, Tom. I mean, of all places in the world, that oil-producing nation of Afghanistan. We all know the millions of barrels today being exported there.
Exactly.
The U.S. went to Central Asia.
Yeah, even if it did, the U.S. doesn't even need the oil anymore. I mean, it's it hasn't for quite a long time. So I think we'll wrap it up there. We think, Bill. This is sort of a short August episode. There's a lot going on. We're gonna record more episodes. I think going forward, I'd like to transition, if we can, to a video format. What do you think? So you can see some of our colorful facial expressions. You can see me sort of smirking at stuff, and Bill, looking at me when he uses a naughty word or whatever, or Bill starts talking about going under the covers again.
Ooh,
no, Bill, stop.
Under the covers.
And you can see, sort of our exchange on that. You can also see the glorious confines of our housing that we live in. You can see me up in sort of the loft area of my home where I record, which is basically a glorified attic. It's sort of very stuffy, but hey, it's cozy. And you can see Bill wherever you're in your mountain retreat there. Bill, is that where you are today?
I am right now, yes.
Yeah, son of a bitch.
Listen, Tom, if they could stand my face, then we'll do video. Like I always say, I have a voice for print and a face for radio. So let's do it.
Well, you just gotta put up with my New York sports gear, because that's what I wear doing this stuff. So as long as you don't mind seeing Giants hats and Yankees hats, which I know you don't like, Bill, you're a Philly guy. So as long as people don't mind seeing that stuff, we can transition to video. But also, we're also going to get some, if we do the video stuff, we can show you guys some of the merch we hope to have coming down the line here. We can show you some other stuff. Hopefully we'll have some guests on video as well, so we can see their facial expressions and how they react to certain things. We're definitely planning over the next several months to line up more guests. We're sort of in this lull here for the summer, trying to close out August before we get ramped up again for the fall. We're going to be doing a lot more. I'll do this again because it'll make Phil happy. If you can go give us that 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts, that'd be wonderful. Again, I don't even have Apple Podcasts, but apparently it's very good for you to give us a 5-star rating. We appreciate it. We're going to have more content for you again soon here. But thank you once again for listening to this week's episode of Generation Jihad. Please do subscribe to the show. As a reminder, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else you listen to your show. So you just need to bleep out the naughty words that Bill likes to use. And we'll see you again next week.